Daniel bought a coffee every morning on his walk to the train station. The same order, the same $5, the same barely conscious tap of his card against the reader. He'd done this for 11 years without once calculating what it actually added up to, because $5 felt too small to matter, a rounding error in a life full of larger decisions. Then one morning, waiting in a line that was moving slower than usual, he pulled up a compound interest calculator out of idle curiosity and typed in $5 a day. He assumed he'd see a modest number. He did not expect to sit through 3 more people ordering coffee before he could bring himself to close the app. My name is Emory, and if you've ever dismissed a small daily expense as too tiny to matter, the kind of amount that barely registers against rent or a car payment, then this video should help explain what actually happens when a number that's small gets redirected somewhere else for long enough. And if that's useful to you, sticking around and subscribing helps this channel keep breaking down the parts of personal finance that live in the details everyone assumes don't matter. Most people think $5 a day is financially irrelevant, too small to plan around, too small to bother automating, essentially background noise in a monthly budget. They're completely wrong, and the reason matters more than the number itself, because the entire mechanism of compound growth doesn't care how large or small the initial contribution is. It only cares how consistently it happens and how long it's left alone, which means a small number treated seriously often outperforms a larger number treated carelessly. To understand why, it helps to start with the raw arithmetic before any growth gets added at all. $5 a day comes to roughly $150 a month, which totals $1,800 over a single year, an amount most people could believe without much resistance. Over 10 years, simple contributions alone reach $18,000, over 20 years $36,000, and over 30 years $54,000, numbers that scale exactly the way anyone would expect, linearly, predictably, without any surprise built in yet. The surprise doesn't come from the contributions. It comes from what happens once those contributions are invested, rather than simply set aside. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting. Invested consistently in a broad market index fund, earning a typical long-term historical return of around 7% annually after inflation, that same $5 a day produces a meaningfully different picture. By year 10, total contributions of $18,000 have grown to roughly $26,000, meaning growth alone has added about $8,000 on top of what was actually put in, a number large enough to notice, but still modest compared to what comes later. This early decade behaves like learning an instrument, technically developing but not yet loud enough to feel rewarding, which is precisely the stage where most people quit small, consistent habits, not because the mechanism has failed, but because it hasn't yet gotten loud enough to reward continued attention. By year 20, the picture shifts meaningfully. Total contributions of $36,000 have grown to somewhere near $91,000, meaning growth has added roughly $55,000, more than the entire amount ever contributed. This is the threshold where the account stops behaving like a container for small daily amounts and starts behaving like an independent, second source of accumulation, quietly outproducing the very habit that started it. Someone who began this at 25 would be 45 at this point, likely still buying coffee, likely still not thinking about the $5 at all, while an entirely separate financial story has been writing itself in the background the whole time. Before going further, it's worth pausing on a detail easy to skip past. That 7% figure already accounts for inflation, which matters enormously for a number this far in the future. A raw, non-inflation adjusted return might sound larger on paper, closer to 9 or 10% using historical averages. But comparing a dollar figure decades from now to today's dollars without adjusting for inflation creates a misleadingly inflated sense of purchasing power. $91,000 in 20 years, expressed in today's buying power, still functions as $91,000 worth of actual groceries, rent, or tuition, because the 7% figure has already stripped out the portion of growth that inflation would have quietly eaten away. This is why every number in this video is expressed this way, in real, inflation-adjusted terms, rather than nominal figures that look larger but buy less. Someone might reasonably ask whether choosing coffee specifically feels a little arbitrary, whether this works the same way for any small recurring expense someone might redirect. It's a fair question, and the honest answer is that the specific expense doesn't matter at all. The mechanism responds identically to $5 redirected from coffee, from a subscription service, from a daily snack, or from simply choosing to invest $5 that was never being spent on anything specific in the first place. The coffee example works well for illustration because it's a familiar, universal habit, not because there's anything uniquely powerful about caffeine spending specifically. It's also worth addressing directly what account this $5 a day should actually go into, since the mechanism only works as described if the money is actually invested rather than left in a low-interest savings account. For most people, the simplest starting point is a retirement account offered through an employer, particularly if that employer matches contributions, since a match functions as an immediate, guaranteed return before any market growth even begins. Absent an employer match, an individual retirement account opened independently offers similar tax advantages, and inside either account type, a broad market index fund, the kind holding hundreds of companies at once rather than betting on any single business, remains the simplest instrument suited to a small, automated, long-term contribution like this one. The account type matters because of taxation, not because of the amount. $5 a day inside a tax-advantaged account compounds meaningfully faster over multiple decades than the same $5 inside a taxable account, simply because less of the growth gets diverted away each year. By year 30, contributions total $54,000, while growth has compounded to somewhere near $182,000, meaning growth alone now accounts for more than 3 times what was ever directly contributed. This is the stage that behaves less like a snowball rolling downhill and more like a boulder that's long since crested the top of the hill and is now rolling almost entirely on its own momentum, requiring the same $5 a day it always did, but producing a result that no longer resembles the size of that daily habit whatsoever. Someone might reasonably ask what this actually changes in a practical sense, since a number on a spreadsheet 30 years out can feel abstract compared to an actual difference in daily life. This is worth being honest about directly. An extra $180,000 by a specific milestone birthday doesn't necessarily mean an early retirement or a dramatically different lifestyle, but it does mean something concrete and real, a genuinely larger cushion heading into retirement, the ability to retire a few years earlier than otherwise possible, or simply a meaningfully smaller amount of financial stress carried into later decades of life. Option. To make this even more tangible, it's worth comparing what happens to 2 people making functionally the same choice but starting at different ages, since time in this specific mechanism behaves unevenly rather than proportionally. Someone starting this exact $5 habit at 25 and continuing for 40 years, reaching age 65, ends up with contributions of $72,000, but growth compounding to somewhere well over $500,000, an amount that dwarfs the daily habit that produced it. Someone starting the identical $5 habit at 35 instead, 10 years later, contributing the same amount for 30 years rather than 40, ends up with growth closer to $182,000, the same figure calculated earlier. The contribution habit was identical in both cases. The only difference was 10 years, and that single decade accounts for a difference of well over $300,000 in the final outcome, a gap driven entirely by time rather than effort, willpower, or the size of the original decision. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting a second time, because the daily amount itself is worth examining directly rather than assuming $5 is the only number worth discussing. Doubling the habit to $10 a day roughly doubles every figure already walked through, 30 years of contributions reaching approximately $108,000, with growth compounding to somewhere near $364,000. Doubling again to $20 a day, an amount closer to a daily lunch out rather than a single coffee, produces contributions of around $216,000 over 30 years, with growth reaching somewhere near $728,000. The relationship holds with remarkable consistency. The daily amount scales the outcome almost exactly proportionally, which means the specific number someone chooses to redirect matters primarily in how sustainable it feels to maintain for decades, not in whether the underlying mechanism will work, since the mechanism works identically regardless of scale. Someone might reasonably ask what happens to this plan during a market downturn, since a 30 or 40-year period practically guarantees several of them along the way. It's a fair concern, And the honest part of the answer is that a downturn genuinely does reduce the value of whatever's already invested at that moment. That decline is real and shouldn't be minimized. But contributions continuing through that same downturn are buying in at lower prices, meaning the specific conditions that feel worst in the moment are quietly benefiting the ongoing contribution side of the plan. And historically, investors who kept contributing consistently through downturns, even a small $5 a day, have outperformed those who paused or stopped entirely over a long enough time horizon. This isn't a claim that market crashes are secretly good news. Existing money still experiences the real decline. It's a narrower, honest claim that new contributions specifically benefit from those lower prices along the way. There's a version of this conversation that tends to focus entirely on delayed gratification, on giving something up now for a reward decades later. And it's worth addressing that framing directly because it isn't quite accurate to what's actually happening here. $5 a day, redirected into an investment rather than a daily purchase, doesn't require living without coffee, or without whatever small daily expense someone chooses to examine. It simply requires deciding that this specific small, recurring amount is worth automating into growth rather than treating as invisible spending. For many people, the actual daily experience of life doesn't change at all. The coffee still gets bought, or doesn't, based on genuine preference rather than financial pressure, while a second, entirely separate $5 moves automatically into an investment account that requires no attention once it's set up. This connects to something worth naming plainly. The reason $5 a day feels too small to bother with isn't a flaw in the amount itself. It's a limitation in how the human brain naturally processes small, recurring numbers compared to large, one-time ones. A single request to invest $1,800 all at once tends to trigger far more hesitation and deliberation than an automated $5 daily transfer that never requires an active decision at all, even though the two are mathematically identical over a year. This is precisely why automating a contribution at this scale matters more than the dollar amount itself, because removing the daily decision removes the exact friction point where most small, consistent habits quietly fail to become long-term ones. By the time this same $5 habit reaches a milestone like 20 years in, for someone who started in their mid-20s, the growth portion alone, at roughly $55,000, sits close to what many people consider a meaningful head start on a home down payment, a significant contribution toward a child's education, or simply a substantial cushion that changes how job loss or an unexpected life event gets absorbed. None of this required a raise, a windfall, or a dramatically different income. It required $5 a day, automated, and left alone for 2 decades. So if the actual question is what life looks like after investing $5 a day, the honest answer isn't a dramatic lifestyle transformation or an early retirement fantasy. It's something quieter and more concrete. A specific number, decades from now, expressed in real purchasing power rather than an inflated figure on paper, that exists entirely because a small, easily dismissed daily amount was redirected once, placed inside the right kind of account. And the math doesn't require the amount to feel significant on any single day for it to become significant over enough of them. And it doesn't punish someone for starting with something this small either. It simply keeps working, exactly as consistently on $5 as it would on 20, for as long as someone lets it.